the outlook for environmental policy in a Trump administration promises to be quite different than it was under the Obama administration. And to talk about that, we have a great panel of two senior environmental NGO leaders and two leading energy and environmental experts who both worked in the administration of George W. Bush. And I'll let our moderator introduce them. I want to thank them all for traveling from near and far. In the case of Jim Connaughton, far from California. Thanks for being here. So to moderate that panel, I'll invite to the stage the Honorable Phil Sharp, a legend in the world of energy policy, a congressman for 2 decades, president of Resources for the Future for a decade, recipient of the Department of Energy's Schlesinger Medal for Energy Security and countless other awards, and now a fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Phil, there you are. Phil Sharp.
Our panel, come on up. Okay, we've got things reorganized here. Jason, thank you so much for that introduction, and I appreciate being invited here to moderate today. Frankly, as a former member of Congress, I'm happy to be invited just about anywhere. But we're glad to have this panel, which is to focus, as you know, our panel assignment is on an outlook about environmental policy under the new administration. And I think when we think of the word outlook, one always is wise to put the word uncertainty in there because you're talking about the future. But I think given the extraordinary potential for change here, we're really talking about a lot of speculation at this early stage by our panel. And so each of them reserve the right to change their minds as the situation in Washington alters. But obviously we had a situation where this is a very unusual moment in American history because we've had an extraordinary change in Washington's power structure with the Republican Party now in charge of both houses of Congress, and also obviously with a president, perhaps an unconventional Republican, but a president of the same party, and we haven't had that for quite some time. And also I might add that, so we have the potential is there, or the opportunity is there for really extraordinary changes on the legislative front on basic policy, whether it's in the regulatory frame, whether it's in government spending, whether it's in the structure of taxes, whether it's on infrastructure. Could even go so deep as to transforming the way in which the traditional rules operate for regulations being made within the federal establishment. And of course, we saw both in the election and since the election some major promises of significant change. So we are not talking about your sort of marginal potential activities here. And early indications, and I use the word indications in the first 3 months, because only a few real actions, that is, actions that are firm and will take effect, have actually occurred, despite the fact that there are lots of executive orders, there's a budget blueprint, but all of these, by and large, are more aspirational or directive of what they would like to accomplish than they are of the final accomplishment. That's the natural order of the way the process works. So some of these actions will require actual rule making to undo an old rule, or they will face court challenges in many cases, or they actually require the U.S. Congress to engage and improve the action, and they all require the commitment of follow-through by the administration, something that all administrations find more difficult than they would wish to have. Just to give a couple examples here, obviously we have had real actions on the repeal of several of the regulations that were in existence under the Obama administration near the end of the administration. Under the Congressional Review Act, that's possible for the Congress to actually have another vote on it and without the filibuster interfering, and so they've done that on 11 occasions. Only a couple of them deal with energy. That timetable is about to run out for that kind of activity, so it's not going to be very large. We've also seen a claim that they will rewrite, if not eliminate, the rule on the Clean Power Plan. That's the regulation of carbon dioxide on power plants. We've also seen that they want to reopen the midterm review on the fuel economy standards that are in place, kind of thing. So those are two of the larger so-called climate initiatives. And then, of course, there's the budget blueprint, which is only a sketch of what they would like to have happen in the expenditures of the federal establishment, but in fact are highly focused in detail, or more so in detail on this area of climate change programs than on anything else. For example, they would eliminate totally the 4 missions, satellite missions at NASA that relate to Earth observation that at least in part or in whole are related to climate change. They would also eliminate the new technology or fairly recent technology innovative organization called ARPA-E, which by and large has had extraordinary support across the board in politics. And of course, a lot of the science expenditures on climate they would eliminate too. But this is a blueprint. This is not a final decision. Well, to talk about these things and more, because I only touched on a couple of the items, we have a great panel here, which I trust will have diverse points of view. Next to me is Karen Harbert. She is the president and CEO of the Institute for the 21st Century for 21st Century Energy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and she's had experience as a key leader in the Department of Energy as an assistant secretary there in the previous administration. Bob Perciasepe, next to her, is currently head of something called C2ES, or the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, and he's a former deputy administrator at the Environmental Protection Agency. And I believe his organization likes to characterize himself as somebody who tries to bring a whole stakeholders together to advance a good climate and energy policy. Next to him is Diane Regas. She is the executive director of the Environmental Defense Fund, which of course is one of the long-standing and preeminent environmental advocacy organizations in the United States. She's recently returned from a trip to China and Europe, talking about these various issues, and her conclusions from that trip are written up in the Forbes magazine, I think of last week or the week before. And then finally, we have, last but not certainly least, Jim Connaughton, who is one of the bright lights in energy discussions all around the country all the time. Jim is a former head of the White House Council on Environmental Quality under George W. Bush, but he's had several positions in American businesses, very prominent positions going forth. So let's do this. Let's turn very quickly. I'm just going to put some general questions out to them. The first one is asking people, and Diane's listed first in the program, so I'll just ask her first, but everybody can then respond to, well, which of these items, either the ones I've mentioned or others that are being projected ahead, which would you consider significant, that they are the most important ones that are either going to maybe have a real impact?
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to join you here today. I think I'm quite biased by my last couple of weeks. I had the opportunity to meet with government and business leaders around the world as I traveled from Portugal to London to China to Japan. And it really underscored for me how out of step the United States government is today. Climate change is accepted as a reality that we need to deal with, and governments around the world are stepping up to deal with it. But that's old news to some extent. I want to focus on one thing that I really walked away with, which is the competitive threat to the United States of what is happening around the world. We really stand to lose in this race for innovation on clean energy by taking a pause in the policies coming out of Washington, D.C. There is a race on. China has just canceled 100 coal plants. They're investing hundreds of billions of dollars to drive down the cost of installing solar, installing renewables. They are building infrastructure around the world. And the same thing is happening elsewhere. And the policies of the government, whether it's research, whether it's sensible regulations that set standards and give states and companies flexibility to meet them, can help. I recall, I'm a little embarrassed to say I do, but I recall in the 70s when the auto industry in this country wasn't able to compete facing the first oil crisis. And it started a gap in competitiveness And I see that gap starting now for U.S. industry in the clean energy field. And I think we need to pay attention to it not only because climate change threatens everything that we care about, food production, stability, but also because of the competitive position of our country.
Jim, you have a difference of opinion, or are there other things you would focus on that's you think is significant?
I was hoping to go last. So, good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm going to give you a completely different perspective. I share the comments that Diane just said, so let me start with that. But what is the most consequential thing right in front of us, not just on combating carbon emissions, but fostering more efficiency and driving for a major new investments in all of our infrastructure? Well, it's called tax reform. So to me, as a market-based environmentalist and conservationist, we have an opportunity in front of us that we have not seen in over 30 years. So let's just quickly go through it. $2.75 trillion of money parked overseas, sitting in the coffers of companies like Apple. You just heard from Lisa Jackson, who want to bring it back and reinvest it. And in order to take advantage of that, they've got to actually spend it on stuff in America. And every new thing they buy, you heard the commitment from Lisa Jackson, is market-driven environmental improvement. So $2.75 trillion, they'll put a 10% tax on that. That'll reserve then another $275 billion plus for infrastructure upgrades, and a huge loss of inefficiency of fuel consumption, a huge inefficiency of our business environment is the fact that we have this sagging infrastructure, and actually costs us in terms of not just carbon emissions, but also conventional air pollution as well as water consumption. If you cut the corporate tax rate by any amount, and if you allow for expensing of purchases of new capital equipment to be accelerated to the present rather than amortized over time, that's another several $1 trillion of money finding its way into the American system. And I think we can all agree that if I've got another dollar to spend on something new, I'm not going to buy something less efficient than what it's replacing. And so we have this massive opportunity in front of us to see some very dramatic market-driven outcomes. Combine that then with this bipartisan consensus on technology, innovation, and advancement, but this bipartisan insistence that it be done on more of a public-private partnership basis. We've got some leaders in the room, I'm seeing one of them here in the front row, who have demonstrated the capacity to fundamentally transform our energy system. And that's the advent of fracking, both for gas production, but also for much more efficient domestic production of petroleum. I mean, in terms of the carbon abatement, the air pollution benefits of that, as well as the water benefits of that, because we have the most stringent water regulations on Earth and require the most efficient utilization of water. All of this is a net sustainability gain to the American economy. So where I am focusing my efforts is on the big slugs of money, the technology advancement, and maybe I could hope then for a renewed consensus, not just on renewables, which are very important, and are already locked in. The Trump administration can't change that. It's 37 states. But maybe we'll begin to see real investment in balancing out the renewables with baseload nuclear, which go very well together, and then seeing in gas and real investment in carbon capture, use, and storage. You won't see a real investment in that unless there's a future for coal in America. So I want to marry clean coal with a real, you still need a public signal on carbon abatement, and maybe we can put that package together. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. I've lived through one of them before. I want to live through another one. So, this has promise if we could focus on outcomes, as opposed to focusing on what I think are actually more over-sensationalized marginal issues, such as the Clean Power Plan, which is already being complied with. And even if it goes away, the curve of carbon emissions from power plants is already on a very positive trajectory. So we can spend 90% of our political capital on that, and it's pretty meaningless. I'd say shift the political capital over to where the real money is, and it can be quite consequential and a leadership opportunity for America.
Well, I want to get Karen and Bob in on the first question, but then if others want to kind of respond to each other, don't hesitate. Karen.
Sure. Well, at the risk of quelling some of the hysteria, let me take us through the wash and spend cycle of what I think is going on. And when the president came into office, he inherited an economy that wasn't even growing at 2%, far below where our potential is at the moment. And so in looking across the entire economy and looking at the bright spots, obviously energy is a very bright spot. Energy of all forms, conventional, unconventional, renewables. And in looking at that and looking at how I think the previous administration saw that energy abundance as a liability, this administration looking at it as an asset. And how do we capitalize on that opportunity? Because every one of our 50 states is now in the energy business. Whether you're producing it, obviously everybody's consuming it, but you're part of the supply chain that Lisa talked about earlier. That how do we capitalize on that energy abundance to actually foment, stimulate economic growth in this country and create the jobs that bring people back into the workforce that have left? And by the way, that's not just in the energy industry. It is actually all the industries that are coming because of our affordable energy here. They're coming from Europe. They're coming from overseas. They're coming from the Middle East. And investing here. I mean, the largest chemical company in Germany is largely now an American company, BASF, capitalizing on our low energy costs, our low natural gas costs, and that will be stimulative. So I think he's looking at it from an E, the economy. He's putting energy, environment, and the economy on the same footing, whereas before it was the environment first and everybody else get to the back of the bus. And we have seen Europe put climate change first at the top of their policy lens, and what happened? Energy costs went up, industries moved here, they became less productive, and now they are returning to their old energy policies and turning on some of their older plants. So America, we get so, derided in the media about not leading on climate. I like to remind everybody that, the 1970s laws that were put into place have largely worked. We've cleaned up a lot of our air, we've cleaned up a lot of our water, we have more progress to make. But we are leading, and we're doing that while we've grown the economy, we've grown the population, we've grown the vehicle miles that we travel, we've grown the population. Our energy consumption didn't go up as much, our efficiency went up, and our emissions came down. Now that's a success story. And I think that's what needs to be continued. So embracing the 3 E's, using it to our advantage, attracting industries here, and holding industry to account to do what's environmentally right for our country. If you looked at Perry, Zinke, and Pruitt, all of them understand their portfolios pretty darn well, and they've all said, look, we're here to grow the economy, but not to do it at the expense of the environment and to capitalize our abundant resources, period. They're all in the same boat.
Bob?
What was that question that you asked?
Oh, well.
No, don't. No, I'm making light of the manifestos. Let's look at reality. The price of energy across the board and the number of jobs in energy in the United States is up, not down, during the last 8 years. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking and reevaluating and seeing how we achieve our goals of the 3 E's, which I think is any rational person is going to agree we have to try to balance those 3 things, the economy, energy, and the environment. But let's not start off by saying, we've failed to do that, because I think the question is how do we continue to maintain the momentum and get where we need to go while we're trying to clean the environment. So, you asked, I think, the simple question of what is the biggest issue in front of us, and I think the biggest issue in front of us is if there is an improved way to go about doing that, what is it? And it can't just be we're not going to do anything or we're going to cut the budgets. It's got to be some alternative plan. And so I think, I'm of the school that there's always a better way to do things. I think we should do things and reevaluate them. Jim and everybody here on the panel has got good ideas. What we need is the leadership where they tell us what the good ideas are and what the plan is and how they're going to go about doing it. I was at a conference last week of all the environmental commissioners from all the states in the United States who have been told, at least rhetorically, that they want to be more deferential to them and let them take more leadership. Yet the budget, again, just a proposal, actually reduces the resources from the federal government to help the states actually take on those responsibilities. So if you look at all of this, looking for new ways to do things, looking for balancing the 3 E's, I think is a good way to think about it. The question is, what is that alternative plan? Is it in the country's interest to have any one of those E's more dominant than the other? And I think, right now we're not seeing where the balance is.
Yeah, I guess I do want to pick up on Bob's point, which is We do find ourselves in a bit of a trap, and Bob, you're going to agree with me, I'm going to correct you, which is a zero-sum trade-off among the three is not the way forward, and it's never been the way of the past. It's actually how to align the focus on the economy, the focus on energy, and then the focus on the environment in a way that's mutually optimizing. And our greatest leaps forward have happened in America when that has occurred. And so we shouldn't lose sight of that. The other thing that we know in America better than almost anyone else is if we can align that well, and then EDF was the leader in driving more performance-based market-based tools for regulation. We know then the market figures out how to tell them where to jump to. The market will get there in more creative, clever, faster ways than a regulator could ever design. And you've got 4 people on this panel that have had their hands on those kinds of policy reforms that could be exceedingly valuable. Because my view is we are not moving as fast as we can be. Again, I don't limit myself to carbon abatement. I care a lot about conventional air pollution that still hospitalizes and sickens people. I care a lot about water, and not just water pollution, but water conservation and how we're using our land. And so the more we can focus our efforts, and there's this, there's, whether you like it or not, this dissonance in the change in government is always an opportunity for policy entrepreneurs. And so the question for all of us is how can we take advantage of this dissonance and find the places where we can make leap ahead progress. One other just factoid, the Clean Power Plan, for all its praise and criticism, at the end of the day would have cost something like $100 billion to comply with it. That's a lot of money, but again, I want to compare for you what I was talking about earlier is trillions of dollars of investment in modern infrastructure, modern facilities, and energy efficiency. So don't lose sight of the big picture of our markets and our energy systems when we're haggling over consequential, but ultimately much smaller battles with higher profile.
So Jim, I'm really glad that you brought up tax reform, because I do agree that there's an opportunity there if tax reform goes forward to create the kinds of incentives that can allow the markets to help us solve the problems. There's been a lot of good discussion about a carbon tax. There's been other ideas on the table, but I'd observe 2 things. One is that actually has to be one of the goals, that to do a tax reform and simply hope that we get progress, which isn't necessarily what you're saying, but tax reform isn't inherently going to help us on climate or clean air problems. And that gets to my second point, which is I think we need to recognize that what's going on at EPA right now is not just within the frame of the usual and healthy debate back and forth about how do you get to the environmental goals that we've had in place in the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act and other important laws for the last 50 years. What's going on right now is really a scorched earth, outside the mainstream approach, proposing to cut EPA's budget by 30%, putting a hold on health-based standards, putting holds on regulations across the board without having any plan or commitment to actually put in place a better plan gives me grave concern, and that concern is shared by the American public. There's a new poll that just came out in the last couple of days that shows that the handling of environmental issues by President Trump and his administration is the most disapproved policy approach that is being taken in Washington right now. 2/3 of the American public disapproves of the performance on environmental issues. And interestingly, especially in this room, 80% of millennial voters disapprove of the approach on the environment. So I think that's indication that something's wrong, and that something is we need to have a commitment to achieving the goals, whether it's addressing air pollution that we've known about for a long time, whether it's addressing carbon emissions. And I'm quite concerned about veering away from that historical consensus rather than focusing on, okay, there's more efficient ways. We should be giving the markets flexibility. We should be demanding performance, not trying to control behavior, because we want to get as much environmental protection as we can, and that means making it as cheap as we possibly can. So I'm with you on a lot of what you said, Jim.
I think we have to address the regulation nation that we have become. because we have seen just an onslaught of regulation from Washington, and some of it is good and some of it is not. It is time, as Jim just said, when you change administrations, is to take a healthy pause and look at what is right for the economy, what is right for our energy sector, what is right for our environment. And as you're looking at that, we have to embrace a couple of things. That a lot of the recent regulations have really been put into place to have a managed outcome, to ensure that we have the mandates and the regulations in place, that we have a few selected energy sources become more prevalent at the expense of others. And I think what you're seeing now is, let's take a pause and let's figure out how, instead of making those forms of energy that we have relied on for so long more expensive, let's look at the way that we could actually have some of these forms become less expensive and everybody compete in the marketplace. And part of that is by removing some of those regulations that have that intended outcome. But it's also about getting the nation, built again. Because whether it's conventional or renewable, we have antiquated energy infrastructure, we have antiquated water infrastructure. Look at Flint, Michigan. That we need to actually build some things, and it takes a really darn long time to build anything in this country. And so that's why everybody's taking a really hard look at permitting reform, which would benefit all forms of energy. So I don't see this being like the teeter-totter. It's trying to find ways to balance things, to get people back to a common state, to be able to embrace the 3 E's and unleash the power of energy in a powerful way, but not at the expense of the environment.
Well, let's talk about coal, because that seems to be an undertow here. Jim, you just said the Clean Power Plan would cost $100 billion, yet you also said it's being implemented anyway. So is it actually costing $100 billion or not? So I think it's not costing $100 billion. I think market forces, which you totally are an adherent of, are actually making it happen, because coal cannot compete with renewable energy and natural gas. We've talked about this already this morning with Jack Lew. Now, we could argue that we made coal too expensive because we're reducing the pollution from it. We certainly are not reducing the carbon from it yet. So we're reducing the other criteria pollutants, which I believe the President of the United States says he would like to see pristine air. I think that was a quote.
Immaculate
air. Thank you, Jim. That's right. You and I had this conversation before. So, which is totally right, because I think he's trying to balance these things in his way. But to pretend that somehow letting certain parts of the energy portfolio pollute more is the answer to having a more balanced portfolio, I don't think is the right way to go. I think the market is moving in the right direction. A number of people, including Lisa Jackson, who worked earlier on parts of the Clean Power Plan, obviously we all understand, myself included, I think we will beat those goals without the Clean Power Plan. The question is, what's the federal leadership going to be? And let me just throw this out here for the group, is another decision that is still before the administration is what to do about the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is a global framework that I think the President and his staff have heard from just about every world leader they've met with, that they really want them to think hard about staying in it. And I think they're going through a very deliberative process right now to try to figure out what they will do there. I think that actually has a way to create a global framework. It's not the strongest agreement in the world, but it's one that everyone agrees to. And so if you can build on that and then look at how that might affect our alternative plan, whatever it may be, in the United States to meet any obligation that we may have, and they may want to reconsider what that is, but the idea is that would be something, and it could be just what the market's doing now, or it could be something more. But I think the consternation is how is this all going to work? It can't be just let's remove requirements for pollution control. Well, so the last point on that is that the other way to approach this, as I think Jim has mentioned, is to enhance the market mechanisms that are out there, one way or the other. And there's lots of different alternatives on that. But I think looking to the administration to say, if we're not going to do it this way, how are we going to do it? How are we going to maintain this progress on the environment while we do the other growth? That is, I think, the question before us. And I think that the approach being taken now is just going to flip who's litigating with who. You're just going to have more uncertainty for businesses.
But I just want to go back to this question of climate change. I don't think it falls in the general category of it's just another environmental thing, because depending on your sense of urgency and what needs to happen here, it implies, I think, a transformation over some period of time of our energy system. It's not just a matter of putting a bag on the back of a coal plant and capturing stuff at this point. And so the question is really here is, are you satisfied that we're moving ahead at a reasonable pace and the federal government just can get off everybody's backs and not worry about it? Or does it have to be investing its dollars in science and in ARPA-E? And does it need to be having some kind of regulatory or carbon tax kind of thing? Or you just leave it kind of to get us there?
Here, let me grab that one first.
Because let's face it, in other forums, this would not even, this conversation would be brushed off as you haven't even started talking about what's important here.
So first, one, air pollution abatement is still quite important, and carbon emissions is quite important, and we're woefully short of making the progress we need on both. Okay, so that's sort of number one. And if you take, sort of the reasonable projections of what a serious response just on the climate change side needs to be, we've made good progress globally, especially in America, Europe, and Japan. But it is not the trajectory that we need to be on to have a reasonable insurance policy. Okay, so it's just not there. Paris doesn't get you there. The Clean Power Plan doesn't get you there, and everyone agrees on that.
But we have not heard that from anybody in the administration to articulate it the way you have. Am I correct?
Well, I don't know. I'm not in the administration, so.
Well, they make lots of public statements. Excuse me. Go ahead.
But then I want to just assert something that then is seemingly radical, though. Paris will not get us there,
Right.
and the Clean Power Plan will not get us there. Right. And so if we spend 90% of our political capital and all of our time in the next 5 years talking about Paris and the Clean Power Plan, we're going to be exactly where we are today. Okay, this is my fundamental point, because this has to be driven. It has to be driven at a bigger scale. It has to be driven through technology, and it has to be driven through making technology more affordable. Look at why do we have so much solar? Because we had market-based mandates, and because the price dropped.
And
so it made it competitive,
right?
And you got a big subsidy. And so to make it the transformative next jump, EPA-based regulation is wholly inadequate to the task. So that's one. And then two, the other point I want to make is pick up on Karen's point. What's happened gradually over the last 15 years, Bush was a little bit guilty of it, but not a lot. And I think the Obama administration was a lot guilty of it, is we moved back away from this positive shift toward performance-based standards and rules that you could actually predict over the long term and invest against, to now what is really feels to be much more of a fully permissive-based regulatory system. So it's bad enough that we have a lot of regulation, but when I can't know today whether I'll get a permit or what that permit might be and what additional cost will come from it, and it's going to go through litigation, what that means is there's a lot of money sitting on the sideline that's not going into big infrastructure projects, that's not going into better forest management, that's not going into the development of renewable energy and natural gas on public lands, because I can't put the dollar up today and know that I'm going to sort of enjoy the predicted profit from that over the next 20 to 30 years.
So Jim, I want to agree with you on, especially on the first part of what you said. And I would actually put it even more strongly. There is no single institution, and there cannot be any single institution that can adequately solve climate change. Not the Paris Agreement, not the Chinese government, not the American government, not the American national government, not any company, not any consortium, not any research. We need all of it. And there is a lot happening in our country. And a lot of it is incredibly exciting, and there's a lot happening around the world. So just in the last 6 months, the Republican governor, Governor Rauner of Illinois, signed a new law that is going to drive down carbon emissions and spur investment in clean energy in Illinois to the tune of a 56% reduction in the carbon emissions by 2030, way more than they would have gotten under the Clean Power Plan. The Governor Kasich of Ohio similarly has signed a new law that is going to put Ohio on the clean energy path. Walmart is making a commitment to reduce its carbon emissions by a gigaton. Now, for those of you who don't follow how much a gigaton is, which most of us don't, that is more than the annual emissions of the country of Germany. So Walmart alone is doing that. That's all fantastic. And China is moving forward as well. China is going to have its emissions trading system launched this year, and I'm sure they will continue to adjust it and make it work better over the coming few years, and that's not the only thing they're doing. But to me, it needs to be all in. So the federal government, EPA, needs to do its part. The federal government, ARPA-E, and the other institutions need to do their part as well. It's not a single answer. This problem is too big and too complex. We need innovation. We need new technology. We need to drive the markets. But to me, it's not at all an argument for why we should ease up on having at least the basic standards in place that are driving action now and need to drive action over the next couple of years.
We've only got 5 minutes, and I've got a bunch of questions from the audience I failed to get in. One quickly that takes us on a little different topic is nuclear power. And with the recent filing of bankruptcy by Westinghouse, the questioner asked, is that the end of any new nuclear power in the United States? Well, why don't you broaden that and give us a little perspective on nuclear power as a portion of our portfolio?
Well, first of all, I think we can't get to where we need to go by the middle of the century or later in the century without a solid base of nuclear power. We have an existing fleet that's producing near 20% of our overall electricity, which is over 60% of our zero-emitting electricity in the United States. And we start to lose that existing fleet. We're going to replace it with natural gas in all likelihood, and that is going to increase emissions. So not only do we need to have a way to preserve that, which is, go back to what Diane was just saying, I think the Illinois bill actually helped preserve some of the existing fleet in Illinois, and New York has done a similar clean energy standard here in the state of New York to help in that regard as well. So it's really important we do that. It's important we put research into advanced nuclear. Every objective look at what we need to do as a country, in the world itself, is we need both carbon capture and storage on the fossil fuel, and we need more nuclear power by the middle of the century than we currently have today. So it's an important policy thing that I think it resonates in a bipartisan way.
Well, nuclear power is challenged by the markets, low natural gas, and in some markets, incentives for renewables, ironically renewables, challenging nuclear power. They have a business model problem, very high O&M costs. But just as importantly, they have a capital crisis problem. This was brought up earlier, which is if it's going to take me 15 years to go through the permitting process and then I'm going to get litigated, what set of investors is going to sit around and put their bank sheet at risk for that type of a big plant? Which is why I think going forward, we've seen small modular reactors. Now we have the first one with NuScale at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. There is a new, smaller, scalable opportunity for nuclear power, and that could be deployable to places. We've been talking here a lot about the United States, but all of the energy growth in the world is happening outside of this country. We're adding 2 billion people, and the developing world is really the principal source of growth. And how are we going to service those energy needs? And some of it is going to be on the back of fossil fuels, whether you like to hear that story or not. It cannot be all on renewables. And advanced modular nuclear reactors that aren't as seen as risky can be part of that solution as well.
Yeah, I guess where I'd pitch in is, and I never thought I'd say this other than food, or maybe I would only say it in the context of food. I think it's laughable that we're not following France. France is 70% nuclear, 30% nearly completely renewables. They already have a near zero emission electricity mix using technology perfected in America. So there's no reason why we shouldn't already be there today, except for a lot of dissonance in the regulatory system. And so while we look forward to the next generation of small modular nuclear, there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be on an all-out course where the farmers and the cowhands can be friends, pushing more renewables, pushing more nuclear, well balanced with all the gas that's sloshing through our system. And the fact that we don't make leap ahead. We can do that in 30 years because it's been done in 30 years, and we are not on that trajectory today, and we could be. It's absolutely absurd that we're not doing it.
I think Jim Connaughton just came out in favor of a 30-hour work week.
We built our
writing this down.
existing nuclear fleet in less than 30 years.
I would suggest you also came out for a lot of federal policy because that's what France had that helped them go to 70% of their
There's no
power
question.
in
There's
nuclear.
no question. There's a prominent federal role to get the objective agreed and get some of this infrastructure aligned. It's the only way to accomplish it. However, get out of the rest. I mean, the trade-off is get out of all this nickel and dime stuff and focus on the big things that matter.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're glad we could give you insight into what to expect over the next 6 months from the United States government, and good luck. Thank you very much.